The winter of 1944 had wrapped northwestern Europe in a silence so complete that it felt like the war itself was finally dying of exhaustion. Snow fell in heavy, deliberate curtains across France, Belgium, and the German frontier, muffling the distant thud of artillery and turning the roads into white ribbons that disappeared into the pines. In the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, optimistic briefings predicted Berlin by Christmas. Tired divisions were pulled out of the line for hot food, new boots, and the luxury of sleep without steel helmets. Replacements fresh from the States still carried the smell of civilian life in their duffel bags, and cigarette smoke drifted thicker than cordite through every command post from Versailles to the North Sea. Yet in a modest, frost-rimed château just outside the city of Nancy, one American officer refused to accept the quiet at face value. Colonel Oscar Koch, G2, intelligence chief of Lieutenant General George S. Patton's 3rd United States Army, sat alone beneath the green cone of a single desk lamp long after midnight. The room smelled of wet greatcoats, hot sealing wax, and the sharp chemical bite of freshly mimeographed reports. Stacks of intercepted radio logs, aerial reconnaissance summaries, and civilian informant messages rose around him like small white cliffs. On the wall hung the master situation map of the German Western Front, its surface scarred by 15 empty red grease pencil circles where entire divisions had simply ceased to exist in the space of a few weeks. Koch's gloved finger traced those circles again and again, moving from the Eifel region opposite the Ardennes, southward along the Moselle, then back north. There were no signatures of retreat, no frantic hospital trains racing rearward, no panicked radio pleas from shattered units, no sudden collapse of command networks. Instead, there was only a deepening silence where noise had been, and a sudden burst of encrypted radio traffic on frequencies the Germans had abandoned months earlier. He turned to a new folder marked Luxembourg Rail Movements, Civilian Sources. The reports were handwritten in hurried French and translated into terse English. Night of 7-8 December. 30 flat cars with tanks under tarpaulins observed moving west through Bitburg. Engines running without lights. Military police unusually numerous. Another note from a Belgian schoolteacher. Heard many heavy vehicles on forest roads after dark. No headlights. Sound of tracks on frozen ground. Koch underlined the last phrase twice. He opened the Ultra folder, those fragile, priceless decrypts sent from Bletchley Park under the direst secrecy, and watched entire German Corps headquarters change call signs overnight, a trick the Wehrmacht had perfected before Kursk. The pattern was unmistakable to a man who had spent years studying German operational habits, the way a theologian studies scripture. The enemy was not retreating. The enemy was vanishing on purpose. Koch gathered the reports into a single thick folder, pulled on his overcoat, and walked the cold stone corridor toward the operations room. His boots made almost no sound on the frozen flagstones. Inside the larger chamber, red-bulbed lamps cast a submarine glow over the planning tables. Blue and red markers showed Third Army's next advance toward the Saar and ultimately the Rhine. Young staff officers argued good-naturedly about leave rotations in Paris. Someone had produced a bottle of captured schnapps, and laughter echoed off the vaulted ceiling. General George Smith Patton, Jr. sat on the edge of a map table, swinging his legs like an overgrown schoolboy, reading a dog-eared copy of Rommel's Infantry Attacks by the light of a chandelier that had once belonged to some forgotten French aristocrat. The ivory handles of his famous revolvers caught the glow. He glanced up when Koch entered and immediately read the expression on his intelligence officer's face. "Oscar?" Patton said in a voice surprisingly soft for a man whose normal speaking tone could shatter glass. "You look like you just swallowed a live hand grenade. Sit down and tell me what fresh hell the Germans have cooked up this week." Koch did not sit. He laid the heavy folder on the table and opened it with deliberate care, spreading maps and summaries the way a surgeon lays out instruments. 15 red circles stared up at the ceiling like accusing eyes. He placed transparent overlays showing rail movements, fuel convoy sightings, and the sudden spike in high-grade cryptographic traffic. Then he waited. He did not need to speak yet. The evidence spoke first. One of the younger majors laughed nervously. "Ghost divisions again, Colonel?" We've been chasing those phantoms since Normandy." Another officer, sipping the schnapps, muttered something about Koch's kraut paranoia. Patton did not laugh. He had learned long ago that Oscar Koch possessed the rarest gift an intelligence officer can have, the ability to be right when every conventional indicator insisted he was wrong. Patton leaned forward until his nose almost touched the acetate overlay, eyes narrowing to slits of winter pale blue. "How many divisions total?" he asked quietly. "Minimum 15, General, possibly 20 when everything is in place. At least 3 Panzer divisions confirmed by rail flat car counts. Almost certainly 2 SS Panzer Corps. Enough combat power to drive straight through the Ardennes to Antwerp if the weather stays filthy and we stay blind." The major with the schnapps snorted. "With what fuel? With what replacements? In December, through that terrain? Come on, sir. Even the Germans aren't that crazy." Koch did not bother to answer the major. He looked only at Patton. Patton's gaze drifted across the empty red circles, the converging rail lines, the frozen rivers that would soon bear the weight of Panther tanks. He saw it the way a chess master sees the sacrifice 10 moves ahead. He saw it because he had spent a lifetime studying enemies who refused to die when logic insisted they should. He saw it because he had never forgotten the lesson of March 1918, when the Germans, starving, bleeding, and supposedly finished, had nearly broken the Allied armies with stormtroops no one believed still existed. And he saw it because he had spent the last 2 years watching Oscar Koch be right about everything from the Mortain counterattack to the hidden flak batteries outside Metz. The room had gone completely still. Even the schnapps bottle stopped moving. Patton straightened slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the absolute certainty that made men follow him through fire. "Gentlemen, Colonel Koch has just told us exactly where the next major battle on the Western Front will be fought. The only question left is whether we intend to meet the enemy on ground of our own choosing, or whether we will allow him to dictate the field." A chorus of protest erupted. Bradley's 12th Army Group had already dismissed identical warnings as alarmist. Schaeff remained convinced the Luftwaffe was finished, and the Wehrmacht was scraping teenagers and grandfathers off the streets of Berlin. The Ardennes sector was universally regarded as a quiet convalescent home for battered divisions, not a launchpad for a grand offensive. Patton raised one gloved hand, and the room fell silent, as suddenly as if he had pulled a plug. "Colonel Koch and I will be in my office. The rest of you will continue planning the Saar offensive exactly as before. Nothing leaves this building that is not already scheduled to leave. Is that clear?" Chairs scraped. Officers filed out, casting uneasy glances over their shoulders. The door closed with a soft final click. Patton poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a battered tin cup and handed it to Koch. The fire crackled in the marble hearth. Outside, snow tapped gently against the tall windows. "You sure, Oscar?" Patton asked. "I am certain they are massing, General. I am certain the target is the Ardennes. I am not certain anyone above 3rd Army level will believe it until the first shells land on 16th of December." Patton stared into the flames for a long moment. Then he turned, and the famous warrior's mask slipped just enough to reveal the strategist beneath. "Begin the planning. Absolute secrecy. No signals, no written orders above verbal instruction until we are committed. I want 3 complete contingency schemes for a 90-degree wheel to the north. Routes, bridges, fuel dumps, artillery displacements, truck company assignments, everything. If the Germans hit 1st Army in the Ardennes, 3rd Army will be the only force on the continent already pointed in the right direction." Koch allowed himself the smallest exhalation of relief. "Yes, sir." Outside the château, the snow continued to fall in slow, deliberate sheets, erasing tracks, muffling engines, convincing the entire Allied command that nothing large could possibly be moving through the frozen forest. Inside, 2 men began preparing for a storm that existed, for the moment, only in 15 empty red circles and the cold certainty of pattern recognition. Only one general believed the storm was coming. For the next 11 days, the 3rd United States Army lived 2 lives. On the surface, it attacked. Tanks of the 4th and 6th Armored Divisions ground eastward through the Saarland under skies so low the clouds scraped the helmets of the crews. Infantrymen of the 80th and 90th Divisions cleared villages whose names no one would ever remember. Every evening, the situation map in the main war room moved another few inches closer to the Rhine, and every morning 12th Army Group congratulated Patton on his relentless progress. The war, by every visible measure, was proceeding exactly according to plan. Beneath that surface, a second war was being prepared in absolute silence. It began in a small side room that had once been a music salon. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn across the tall windows so that no stray gleam of light betrayed the work inside. A single map of Luxembourg and southern Belgium now covered the grand piano. Red and blue grease pencil lines spidered across it like veins. Colonel Oscar Koch stood at the map's edge from dawn until the early hours of the following dawn, chains smoking lucky strikes until the air tasted of hot paper and his voice grew hoarse. He worked with a tiny circle of trusted officers, the G3, operations planners, the chief engineer, the transportation officer, and two young captains who had once been railroad schedulers in civilian life. No one else was admitted. Messengers carried verbal instructions only. Nothing was committed to paper that left the room. They built 3 separate contingency plans, each one more audacious than the last. Plan 1 assumed the German blow would fall on the VUS. Corps around Echternach and would drive northwest toward Liège. Third Army would disengage along its present front, swing 2 corps north across the Sour and Sauer rivers, and strike the German southern flank somewhere near Bastogne. Plan 2 assumed a deeper penetration toward the Meuse bridges. It required a 90-degree wheel of the entire army, over 250,000 men and 133,000 vehicles, in under 72 hours, something no army in history had ever attempted in winter. Plan 3 was the nightmare scenario. Total rupture of First Army, the Germans already across the Meuse in strength, and Third Army ordered to counterattack westward instead of north. No one liked to speak about Plan 3 aloud. Every bridge between Luxembourg City and the German frontier was secretly resurveyed for ice load and tank capacity. Engineers marked detour routes with scraps of colored cloth tied to pine trees, marks that looked like nothing to a passing civilian but screamed direction to an American truck driver at night. Fuel dumps were quietly doubled and then tripled, the extra 5-gallon jerry cans buried under haystacks and camouflaged with snow. Truck companies practiced night marches with blackout lights no brighter than a cigarette coal. Artillery battalions memorized displacement routes that led not east toward the Saar, but north toward a front they were not officially allowed to think about. Patton moved among them like a man possessed by calm. He appeared without warning in motor pools at a 300, boots crunching on frozen grease, asking sergeants how long it would take to marry up a tank battalion with a truck company in a blizzard. He sat in on briefings wearing an old sweater instead of his famous tie and pearls, listening more than speaking. Eyes flicking constantly to the northern sky, as though he could already see the flares that had not yet risen. When a young major dared to ask why they were wasting time on fantasy plans that Schaeff will never approve, Patton fixed him with a stare that could freeze bourbon. "Son," he said softly, "the only fantasy worse than planning for a disaster that never comes is discovering too late that the disaster was real and you did nothing." Most of the staff thought their commander had slipped a cog. Preparing for an offensive 100 miles away while still fighting a different offensive felt like lunacy. Whispers circulated in the mess. Old blood and guts has finally gone round the bend. Koch's ghost divisions have eaten his brain. Koch heard the whispers and said nothing. He simply worked harder. Each night, he updated the master intelligence summary. Never more than 2 typed pages, never distributed above army level. The vanished divisions reappeared one by one, like ghosts stepping out of fog. The 6th SS Panzer Army opposite the Losheim Gap. 5th Panzer Army south of it. Infantry corps stuffed with fresh Ostfront veterans who knew how to fight in snow. Fuel depots hidden in Eifel valleys, guarded by flak regiments that had disappeared from the Rower front. Every new fragment slotted into the pattern with the clean click of a round chambered into a rifle. On the evening of 12th of December, Koch found Patton alone in the map room, standing motionless before the Ardennes sector as though listening to something only he could hear. "They're almost ready," Koch said without greeting. "I make it 19 divisions in the assembly areas now, maybe 21 by the 15th. Fuel state unknown but improving. Our air can't see through this weather. Luftwaffe has moved 300 fighters to fields west of the Rhine. They'll have one good week of flying weather, and they know it." Patton nodded once. Snow hissed against the windows. "And the Meuse bridges?" "Still intact. No demolitions prepared that we can see. First Army has 4 divisions in the sector, 2 of them brand new, 2 more refitting after the Hurricane. Total frontage, 85 miles. They think it's a quiet sector, George." Patton's mouth twisted at the familiarity. Only Koch was allowed it in private. "Quiet sectors are where empires die, Oscar." He turned from the map and looked at his intelligence officer with something close to tenderness. "You've done your part. Now the rest is up to me." That night, Patton wrote in his diary with a fountain pen that scratched like an angry cat. "If the Germans attack in the Ardennes, we will be the only army on the continent able to respond with speed and power. If they do not, then we have lost nothing but a little sleep and a great deal of fuel. Either way, history will not find Third Army with its trousers down and its boots unlaced." Across the front, other commanders slept soundly. Omar Bradley believed the main threat remained east of Aachen. Eisenhower's intelligence chief, the brilliant but overworked Major General Kenneth Strom, filed Koch's warnings away with a note that read, "Possible spoiling attack at most." In the Ardennes itself, Green troops wrote letters home about the beauty of the snow and how peaceful the forest felt. In Nancy, truck engines were test started at 400, so drivers would know exactly how long it took diesel to warm in sub-zero air. Tank crews practiced changing bogie wheels by lantern light. Hospital trains were quietly moved rearward to clear the lines. And in the music salon that no one entered without Koch's permission, 3 plans waited like loaded rifles. On the 15th of December, Patton summoned his corps commanders, Hoge, Eddy, Grow, and Middleton, to a conference that was not officially a conference at all. They arrived separately, in staff cars with mud-smeared insignia, and were ushered into the curtained room one by one. Patton did not waste time. "Gentlemen," he said without preamble, "in the next 72 hours the Germans may launch a major counteroffensive through the Ardennes. If they do, Third Army will pivot north and smash them in the flank. Your corps will begin disengagement preparations immediately. Verbal orders only. Nothing in writing until I say otherwise." Questions? There were many questions. There were always questions when George Patton asked men to do the impossible, but no one refused. That night, Koch added one final overlay to the master map, probable German jump-off times, based on moon state, road conditions, and the sudden drop in radio traffic that always preceded a Wehrmacht attack. He circled 16 December in red and underlined it 3 times. He found Patton in the chapel of the château, an irony neither man acknowledged, kneeling on the cold stone before a small wooden crucifix that had somehow survived both French Revolution and German occupation. Koch waited in silence until Patton crossed himself and stood. "It's time," Koch said simply. Patton looked at the crucifix a moment longer, then at his intelligence officer. "Then God help the Germans," he replied, "because no one else will." Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The forest was silent and impossibly white, waiting. Inside the château, an army finished the last quiet preparations for a battle no one else believed would ever come. Together, they would plan for a war no one else could see. December 16th, 1944, began with a silence so absolute that it felt like the world had forgotten how to breathe. At 5:30 hours Central European time, that silence ended forever. Across an 85-mile front from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south, the frozen ground shook as if an underground train had derailed. 500 heavy guns of the German artillery opened at once. Flares burst in long white chains above the snow-laden pines. Searchlights bounced their beams off the low clouds to create artificial moonlight, and under that ghostly glare, the first waves of white camouflaged infantry rose from their hiding places and moved west. American outposts died without ever sending a warning. Telephone lines had been cut hours earlier by infiltrating Jedburgh teams dressed in U.S. uniforms. Regiments woke to find their command posts already overrun. In the little town of Lanzarote, 13 men of an intelligence platoon held up an entire SS regiment for almost 20 hours, but no one in the rear knew it yet. By 0800, the roads behind the First Army front were rivers of retreating vehicles and bewildered soldiers who had never believed the Germans still possessed the strength to attack. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, the morning briefing dissolved into stunned disbelief. Major General Kenneth Strong laid the first frantic reports on Eisenhower's desk and watched the Supreme Commander's face go the color of wet ash. Omar Bradley, reached by telephone at Luxembourg City, refused to accept the scale of the penetration for almost 4 hours. "They can't be attacking with more than a corps or two," he kept repeating, as though saying it often enough would make it true. In the Ardennes itself, chaos had a sound. Engines roaring in reverse, small arms fire crackling like burning bamboo, men shouting in languages they had never expected to hear again. The 106th Infantry Division, only 10 days in the line, lost 2 entire regiments before noon. The 28th Division was shredded around Wiltz. By nightfall on the first day, the German salient was already 20 miles deep in places, and the word breakthrough began to appear in signals that only yesterday would have been dismissed as hysteria. But 120 miles to the south, in the frost-covered château outside Nancy, there was no chaos at all. The first telephone call reached Third Army headquarters at 0709. A liaison officer from First Army, voice shaking, reported heavy attacks all along the V Corps front and begged for information about German strength. Colonel Koch took the call himself. He listened for 90 seconds, thanked the man, and hung up without the slightest trace of surprise. He walked straight to the operations room where Patton was already waiting, dressed as though he had never gone to bed. Polished helmet, scarf tucked into his overcoat, the twin revolvers gleaming like accusations. "It's begun," Koch said simply. "Exactly where we thought. They hit with 3 armies, 6th SS Panzer in the north, 5th Panzer opposite Bastogne, 7th Army on the southern shoulder. Scale looks like everything we feared." Patton nodded once. He did not ask for details. He already knew them better than the men currently dying in the snow. "Get the Corps commanders on the secure line. Tell them the contingency is now the main effort. Execute Plan 2 immediately." Within minutes, the château transformed into something between a beehive and a perfectly tuned watch. Staff officers who had spent 11 sleepless nights rehearsing this exact moment moved with the calm of men who had already lived the day once before in their heads. Verbal orders flew down telephone wires that had been laid weeks earlier for precisely this emergency. Truck companies that had practiced night marches with blackout lights now rolled north in broad daylight, drivers chewing Benzedrine tablets and grinning like madmen because they finally understood why they had suffered through the rehearsals. At 10:30 hours, Eisenhower's chief of staff, Bedell Smith, telephoned from Versailles. The connection crackled with static and panic. "Beetle," Patton greeted him with deliberate calm. "I hear Jerry has finally decided to throw his last party. How bad is it?" Smith's reply came in a rush. First Army was reeling. The center of the line had simply ceased to exist in places. Eisenhower needed to know how quickly Third Army could intervene. "Tell Ike," Patton answered, "that Third Army can put 3 divisions, 2 of them armored, into the attack against the German southern flank by the morning of the 19th. That's 48 hours from now. We'll hit them around Bastogne and keep hitting until something breaks." There was a long silence on the line, broken only by the hiss of distance. 48 hours, Smith finally repeated, as though the number belonged to a different language. "George, that's impossible. You're fighting 100 miles away. You'd have to turn your entire army 90 degrees in winter." "Impossible takes a little longer," Patton said. 48 hours is what we've got. Tell Ike to start praying the weather stays bad enough to keep the Luftwaffe grounded. Because we're coming." He hung up before Smith could argue. By noon, the first columns were already moving. The 4th Armored Division, which only yesterday had been preparing to cross the Saar, executed a clean disengagement that looked almost leisurely to the stunned German observers across the river. Tanks reversed down roads they had just fought to capture. Turrets pointed rearward, crews waving cheerfully at the enemy as if to say, "See you later, somewhere else." At Verdun, in a cold school building that still smelled of chalk dust and children's lunches, Eisenhower convened the most famous emergency conference of the European War. Bradley arrived late, face drawn with exhaustion. Hodges of First Army was almost speechless with shock. Patton strode in 20 minutes after the meeting began, helmet under one arm, slapping his gloves against his thigh like a man arriving at a football game. Eisenhower wasted no time on ceremony. "Gentlemen," he said, "the situation is critical. We need to know what each army can do and how fast." Hodges could offer nothing immediate. His First Army was still trying to find itself. Bradley outlined a cautious plan that would take weeks. Then, Eisenhower turned to Patton. "George?" Patton walked to the wall map and picked up a grease pencil as casually as if he were ordering lunch. "Mr. Supreme Commander," he said, drawing a bold red arrow from Luxembourg straight into the southern flank of the growing German Bulge. Third Army will attack with a minimum of 3 divisions on the morning of 19th of December. We will advance north until we link up with whatever is left of First Army around Bastogne. Then we will pivot west and drive the bastards into the Rhine or the sea, whichever they reach first." The room went completely still. Grown men who had planned the invasion of Normandy stared at Patton as though he had just proposed flying to the moon. Bradley found his voice first. "George, you're 120 miles away. You have 10 divisions in contact with the enemy right now. You cannot possibly disengage, refuel, and move that distance in 48 hours. It's physically impossible." Patton smiled, the small, dangerous smile that had terrified generations of cadets at West Point. "Omar," he said gently, "my staff has been working on exactly this move for 11 days. The trucks are already loaded, the bridges are reconnoitered, the fuel is in place. The only thing missing was the enemy's cooperation in attacking exactly where we expected him to. He has now kindly provided that cooperation." Eisenhower leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You're telling us you anticipated this offensive?" "I'm telling you Colonel Koch anticipated it," Patton replied. "I merely believed him when no one else would." No one in the room knew what to say to that. Outside Verdun, the first snow of the new storm began to fall, thick and deliberate, blotting out the sky exactly as the German plan required. Inside the schoolhouse, orders were signed that committed Third Army to the greatest emergency redeployment of the war. By nightfall on the 16th of December, while First Army reeled backward in disarray and German radio announced the recapture of territory lost in 1940, Third Army was already moving north at speeds that defied every textbook. Columns snaked along icy roads under blackout lights, drivers navigating by the glow of cigarettes cupped in frozen hands. Artillery batteries displaced in leaps of 20 miles, horses and prime movers slipping on the frozen cobbles of Luxembourg villages. And in the lead tanks, crews sang because they finally understood why their general had driven them half-mad with rehearsals no one else believed would ever matter. At 2300 hours, Patton stood on a hill south of Luxembourg City, watching the endless river of headlights crawling north. Colonel Koch joined him, collar turned up against the wind. "They hit harder than even I expected." Koch admitted, 6th SS Panzer Army is already west of St. Vith. If they reach the Meuse, they won't. Patton said with absolute certainty. "Because we are no longer reacting, Oscar. For the first time since Jerry kicked this off, we are the ones who are ahead of schedule." Far to the north, red and green flares still rose above the burning forest where American soldiers fought and died in confusion. But south of the breakthrough, one army moved with the precision of a watchmaker and the speed of an avenging angel. Patton wasn't reacting. He was executing. No army had ever attempted what 3rd United States Army began at first light on 17 December 1944. 10 divisions, more than 250,000 men, 133,000 vehicles, 1,200 tanks and tank destroyers, 4,000 artillery pieces, and enough ammunition to fight for a month, all had to reverse direction, disengage from one enemy, march north across frozen secondary roads, refuel without halting, and arrive in a new sector, ready to attack an enemy who was already advancing at full speed. Fuel was the make-or-break factor. Everyone knew the Germans had gambled everything on capturing American dumps intact. Third Army refused to gamble at all. Every extra 5-gallon jerry can that had been hidden under haystacks and snowdrifts now appeared as if by magic at pre-selected refueling points. Tankers worked with the speed of pit crews, 4 men to a vehicle, 2 pouring, 2 capping, while engines idled to keep diesel from gelling in the lines. A Sherman needed 70 gallons to fill. Some tanks refueled 3 times in 24 hours without ever stopping for more than 12 minutes. The roads themselves became the true enemy. Ice glazed every surface. Vehicles that slipped off the crown spun helplessly until bulldozers or recovery tanks winched them back. Traffic control points manned by military police in white camouflage capes stood at every crossroads with red-lensed flashlights, waving columns through intersections that had been rehearsed on sand tables in the music salon at Nancy. When a bridge outside Ardennes cracked under the weight of a Pershing-heavy tank, engineers who had memorized the exact location of a bypass ford guided the entire column through chest-deep freezing water rather than lose an hour. Patton moved with the columns like a man riding his own storm. He appeared without warning on roadsides, standing in an open jeep while snow whipped around him, shouting encouragement that carried above the roar of engines. "Keep moving, God damn it! The First Army is dying up there. Every minute you save is 100 American lives." Soldiers who had cursed him for months now cheered when they saw the pennant with the red and blue A of Third Army flying from his bumper. They understood, finally, that every brutal rehearsal, every midnight march, every rehearsal in the snow had been for this single moment. By the night of 18th of December, the impossible was already half accomplished. The 4th Armored Division had covered more than 100 road miles in 36 hours and was assembling south of Bastogne. The 26th Infantry Division, which had been fighting in the Saar, arrived in Luxembourg City so quickly that its advance elements overran a German field hospital that still believed the area was safely behind their own lines. The 80th Infantry Division executed a forced march of 42 miles in 24 hours, men riding on tank destroyers because their boots had frozen to the floorboards of trucks. At No. 300 on the 19th of December, Patton established a forward command post in an abandoned Belgian boys' school outside Ardennes. The building still smelled of chalk and boiled cabbage. Maps were taped to blackboards that had once taught Latin conjugations. Colonel Koch arrived with the latest intelligence summaries. German spearheads were already west of Houffalize, probing for the Meuse crossings. Bastogne, the road hub every German column needed, was surrounded on 3 sides and under heavy attack. The 101st Airborne Division had arrived only hours earlier, trucked in from Reims under emergency orders, and was now digging in under artillery fire that never seemed to stop. Patton studied the map for a long moment, then picked up the telephone to South Corps. "Manton," he told Major General Eddy, "you will attack at 600 with everything you have. Objective, relieve Bastogne by any road you can open. I don't care if you have to fight with bayonets and harsh language. Get through." At 600 on the 19th of December, in a snowstorm so thick that visibility was measured in yards, Third Army attacked north. The sound of it rolled across the frozen countryside like continuous thunder. The 4th Armored's Combat Command Reserve, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, struck along the Ardennes-Château road while the 26th and 80th Divisions fanned out on parallel axes. German resistance was stunned by the speed and violence of the counterstroke. Units that had advanced confidently for 3 days suddenly found themselves under attack from a direction no plan had anticipated. German commanders began sending frantic radio messages that all carried the same refrain: American reaction time was impossible. General von Manteuffel of 5th Panzer Army demanded to know how an entire American army had materialized on his southern flank when intelligence had assured him Patton was fully committed in the Saar. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, listening to the reports in his distant headquarters, simply shook his head and muttered that the Americans had achieved the one thing German planning had counted on them being unable to do: move faster than the Wehrmacht. By noon on the 19th, Abrams' tanks were fighting on the outskirts of Clochemont, only 12 miles south of Bastogne. By nightfall, the corridor was still closed, but it was narrowing hourly. German panzer columns trying to bypass Bastogne to the west suddenly found themselves under fire from American tank destroyers that had appeared as if conjured from the snow. In the surrounded town itself, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe received a German surrender demand and sent back the one-word reply that would become legend: nuts. Few of the men inside the perimeter knew that relief was already clawing its way toward them at a speed no staff college had ever contemplated. On the evening of 22nd of December, Patton stood on a hill south of Bastogne, watching artillery airbursts flicker against the low clouds. Colonel Koch joined him, bringing a captured German situation map that showed Third Army's advance as a red arrow driven deep into the soft underbelly of the entire offensive. "They never believed we could do it," Koch said quietly. "Their timetables are collapsing. Every hour we gain is an hour they lose." Patton nodded, eyes fixed on the distant glow of burning vehicles that marked the ring around Bastogne. "They measured us by their own limitations," he answered. "They forgot that Americans don't know when something is impossible until after they've already done it." Far to the north, the German salient still bulged westward, but its momentum was bleeding out onto the snow with every passing hour. The race for the Meuse had become a race against Third Army, and Third Army was winning. He didn't predict the future, he prepared for it. Christmas Eve 1944 broke clear and bitter cold over the Ardennes. For the first time in 8 days, the clouds lifted, and the sky turned the hard blue of tempered steel. Allied fighter bombers rose in swarms from England and France, hungry for targets they had been denied since the 16th. Below them, the German Bulge looked like a bruised thumb pressed into the white map of Belgium, 50 miles deep at its farthest point, but already beginning to blacken with burning vehicles. At 16:45 hours on 26th of December, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division, punched through the last German cordon west of Bastogne on the road from Ardennes. The lead tank, a Sherman named Cobra King, rolled into the 101st Airborne's lines under fire that still snapped overhead like ripping canvas. Men who had not expected to see another American tank in their lifetime ran forward through the snow, pounding on the turrets and shouting themselves hoarse. Inside Bastogne, medics carried out the wounded on doors and tabletops while the relieving tankers handed over cigarettes and K-rations with frozen fingers. General McAuliffe walked forward, shook Abrams' hand, and simply said, "Thank you." Nothing more was needed. By nightfall, the corridor was 800 yards wide and growing. Engineers bulldozed frozen German bodies off the road to let supply trucks through. The first convoy rolled in at 0200 on the 27th. 10 tons of artillery ammunition, plasma, morphine, and mail from home. One driver carried a small Christmas tree lashed to his hood, its candles long since blown out, but still wired in place. The besieged paratroopers stood along the road and cheered until they had no voices left. Across the Bulge, German commanders began to understand the full magnitude of what had happened to their timetable. General Hasso von Manteuffel, whose 5th Panzer Army had come closest to the Meuse, sent a terse signal to von Rundstedt. American Third Army counterattack from the south has achieved complete tactical surprise. Timetable can no longer be maintained. Field Marshal Model, listening in, simply stared at the map and said nothing at all. Later, in captivity, both men would admit the same thing. They had not believed Patton could move an entire army that distance in winter. They had measured the Americans by the speed of their own exhausted divisions, and the miscalculation cost them the battle. By New Year's Day 1945, the Bulge was no longer advancing, it was contracting. Third Army kept attacking north and west, grinding forward a mile at a time through snowdrifts and minefields. The 11th Armored Division fought its way into Houffalize, while the 17th Airborne dropped onto the northern shoulder. On the 16th of January, the last corridor was closed, when patrols of the 1st and 3rd Armies linked up near St. Vith. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The German army in the west had thrown its last strategic reserve into the snow and watched it bleed out. History would call it one of the greatest defensive victories of the war. Popular accounts would speak of Bastogne's heroic stand, of the clear weather that finally allowed air power to savage the German columns, of Eisenhower's calm leadership, and Montgomery's methodical counterattacks in the north. Books would be written about the Malmedy massacre and the courage of green divisions that refused to break. Films would show tanks sliding on ice and infantrymen with frost-blackened faces. All of it would be true. Almost none of it would mention the 11 days before the battle began. Patton received no new medal for the Ardennes. His Third Army was praised for its brilliant execution, but the official citations never explained how that execution had been possible. The contingency plans drawn up in the curtained music salon at Nancy were quietly filed away and eventually destroyed. The fuel dumps that had never run dry, the bridges that had never collapsed under unexpected loads, the traffic control points that had never jammed. All of it vanished into the anonymous efficiency of victory. Colonel Oscar Koch returned to his intelligence summaries and his quiet corner of the headquarters. He was promoted to brigadier general in due course, but few outside Third Army ever learned his name. When the official U.S. Army history of the campaign was published years later, his warnings and Patton's secret preparations occupied exactly 3 sentences in a 600-page volume. The index did not contain his name at all. Patton himself never spoke publicly about the prediction. In private, he was more candid. To his wife, Beatrice, he wrote on 28th of December, "We knew it was coming, Bea. Koch saw it plain as day, and I believed him when no one else would. The rest was just engineering." To his diary, he was blunter. "If Ike and Bradley had listened to Koch in November, we could have met the bastards on ground of our own choosing and saved 10,000 American lives." But no one wanted to hear bad news in December 1944. He died in a car accident 11 months later, carrying the secret with him. Years after the war, a young officer researching a staff college paper tracked down Oscar Koch at his home in Virginia. The old general poured coffee, listened to the questions, and answered in the same soft, precise voice he had used in 1944. "Did you really predict the exact date and place?" the officer asked. Koch smiled without humor. "I predicted the place and the approximate strength. The date was an educated guess based on weather and moon state. The important thing was that General Patton believed the prediction was possible. That was the difference. Why has no one ever heard the full story?" Koch looked out the window at children playing in the spring sunshine. "Because no one likes to admit how close we came to catastrophe," he said. "It's more comforting to believe the Bulge was a surprise to everyone and that American courage simply overcame the odds. The truth, that 2 men saw it coming and prepared while the rest of the high command refused to look, isn't heroic. It's embarrassing." He paused, then added the line that should have been carved on both their graves. "History prefers legends to warnings." In the end, the Ardennes became the most written about campaign of the European theater, yet the most important part of it remained almost unknown. The story of the one American commander who did not just react, who did not improvise under pressure, who did not scramble when the forest exploded, but who simply executed a plan already 11 days old. The story of the quiet intelligence officer who saw 15 divisions vanish and dared to say what it meant. The story of the only army on the Western Front that turned north before a single order arrived from above, because it had already decided where the real battle would be fought. They never received credit in their lifetimes. They never asked for it. On a winter day, long after both men were dead, a historian walking the ground south of Bastogne found a rusted metal sign half buried in the pine needles. It had once been painted with a simple white arrow and the letters 3A, Third Army Traffic Control, December 1944. The sign pointed north, toward a town that had been surrounded and relieved, toward a battle that had turned the war. The historian stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the same trees that had hidden a ghost army 70 years earlier. Then he understood. History remembers the Bulge. Few remember the man who foresaw it. If forgotten brilliance matters to you, subscribe for more untold World War II history.